Sweet. So I'm Sarah. I'm one of the group leaders for Bond this year. So I thought we could just start off by having you talk a little bit about what you do for the organization and explain Brave Space Alliance's mission.
Um, so I'll start with Brave Space Alliance's mission. Mission is to fight for the liberation of all queer people, but centering and focusing on Black and Brown and Indigenous people, and also centering and focusing on trans people. And we use trans as an inclusive term to mean people who go from male to female or female to male. We also include in our definition non-binary and people like two-spirited, people like that. And so we use trans in like the umbrella term and not just in the way that most people know it. But we are fighting for collective liberation. And I think that's the best way to put it. My job is the not personal assistant. It is the assistant to the executive director. That is my official title. And so I assist LaFi Wade, who is our executive director, in whatever she needs, whenever she needs, however she needs. And so that looks like a number of different things, but it is interesting work. It is work that needs to be done. And for me, at least, it's fun.
Yeah, that sounds like it. And so I'm interested in this whole idea of liberation because I noticed on your website you talk a lot about sort of elevating the narrative for members of the LGBTQ plus community. And that's something we've been talking about a lot in our group leader sessions is sort of this whole idea of storytelling. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you as an organization go about elevating the voices of marginalized members of the community and how you can do that in sort of a safe and productive and truthful way.
So Brave Space Alliance is partly named Brave Space because it is not a safe space. It is a brave space. It is a space for you to be your entire self. It is a space where you can come and you can be who you are. And it's not saying we're not going to hold you accountable to the harm if you do somebody harm or if you do harm in the community. But it is a place where you don't have to know all the right words because you can come here and we will start from a place of understanding instead of a place of judgment. And we will start in a place of love instead of a place of shame. And I believe that that helps a lot. So people can come in and they don't need to know all the right words and they won't get kicked out. So if somebody comes in and they're like, oh, that girl over there, she's a tranny, instead of being like, yo, that's uncalled for, and like just kicking them out, we would take a more community-centered approach, bringing them in, educating them, like really trying to get them to understand. Like, and sometimes it's not about correcting the language. Sometimes it's not about correcting language because that's what community looks like. If community uses these words, then it doesn't need to be fixed because that's the community that they're normally in. We can say, you know, in our space, you know, this is what we do and not kick them out, but we understand people come from a variety of different backgrounds, and letting people be their full person and who they are, and especially like bringing their community and their background with them is important. And so that's why like we are Brave Space, and then lifting, and I think that is part of lifting marginalized voices, but also because we center and focus on our community members and people who are doing the work and people who the situations directly affect. I think that centers and lifts their voices up too. I think the thing that a lot of people don't know is these predominantly white grant makers make grants, and then the people who decide who gets the grants are also white. The community, a lot of the community organizations have a lot of white leadership, and so a lot of the big decisions and a lot of how programs and structures are made by people who are not in community, who do not have any direct contact with the people trying to help. And like, how are you supposed to help people with food insecurity or housing insecurity or escape sex work if they want to, if you don't know anybody in the communities that you're trying to reach out to. And so I'm not saying that they don't help. I'm not saying that white people don't help people who suffer from food insecurity, because they absolutely do. It's just they're 9 times out of 10, they're not Black people, they're not brown people, they're not indigenous, they're not Latinx people. So I think that because we are directly in these communities, members of our staff are part of these communities, our leadership is a Black trans woman who is constantly in this community. I think that because of that we hear, we talk, and we can bring that to the people who recognize us and will listen to our voice. They might not listen to somebody off the street, but we will. We will tell the people who need to be told what the person off the street said, so that we can assist and help our community.
That's interesting. I'd never thought about who's giving out the grants. That's interesting. And I sort of have a question based off that. I mean, you already mentioned that your spaces are predominantly for the African American community.
And brown people. So Latinx people can come, indigenous people can come, Asian people can come.
Yeah, it's amazing. I was wondering, do you ever have instances where white people try and enter that space, and how do you handle it if you do?
So it is not that white people are banned from our space. And I think that is a common misconception. It is that there are a lot of resources out there for white queer people here in Chicago, and they have access to them. It's a little safer for them to do so. They're not going to be persecuted trying to get them as much. But for Black and brown people, it's not the same, and also it's not as safe, and they might not even want to go to the spaces to get the resources out of fear. And so I think that there's a level of trust that we have when we're within community with other POC people, and that doesn't always exist in white-centered spaces. And so when we have a POC-centered space, it often feels like white people aren't allowed to come, and that is not the case. It's just that these resources aren't necessarily for you. And so Stephanie is on staff and is not POC. And then we have people in our support group who are not POC. People come to our events who are not POC. But we want them to understand that even like within coming, you have to recognize your power and privilege. Like we aren't safe to come to your spaces all the time, but you are always safe to come to ours. And so just recognize that and don't take up as much space, and make sure, like, because people can get their resources elsewhere, make sure you're not taking resources out of the people who can't get the resources elsewhere. Like we don't mind, and it's not saying we don't want, like they can come and all of that. And especially they can come if they have questions on like how to be how to decolonialize themselves, how to be less racist, how to be less anti-trans. Like if you want these resources, we have so many books you can come and read, and so many trainings and all of these things. You can come and ask us for these and then pay us to do these trainings. But we're not anti-white or against white people coming into space. We just want them to recognize that there's definitely a privilege and power that they have, and coming into our spaces and exercising of that privilege and power.
And I know you sort of touched on this.
Especially for free. For free.
Oh, definitely. And you touched on this a little bit, but I was just wondering, to make explicit, how should white people, both in and outside of the LGBTQ plus community, go about being allies? Is it being there to ask for resources, or what does that look like to you? And it's not just white people. I think that it is an ongoing process to become decolonialized, to work on unlearning racism, because it's so ingrained in our society, in our media, in our books, in our schools, in everything we do. It is as American as the flag. Racism, flag, democracy. Like democracy. And so I think like that's
part of America. And I think that because we all live here, because we're all citizens, and even if you're not a citizen, like if you're here and you're understanding and living within American culture, it is definitely something to be aware of. And so you have to try and unlearn all of these biases. And sometimes they're subtle, like they're not always like overtly harmful. They're I remember when I was at University of Illinois, a white person came up and tried to touch my hair. And that's not directly harmful, but that definitely, to me, sends a signal that they don't see me as a person who has their own bodily autonomy. And that idea is harmful. And just like how many, not even how many, but at what point do you stop seeing a small black child as cute and seeing them as a threat or a danger? And it's really difficult because I struggle with that as well, because I was raised, I was socialized female and as a woman. And so I was always told to be wary of men. If you see a guy across the street, blah, 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 blah. And so I definitely like have these biases even in myself, where like I don't trust my fellow man because like that's just how I was socialized. And I work every day in unlearning it because it is harmful, and it does lead to bigger and more complex issues. And so you really have to start just questioning literally everything. Literally everything. Like why were hoops and like having a fat ass and twerking considered ghetto before, but then Miley Cyrus did it and now it's cool.
Yeah.
So yeah. So just really stopping and critically thinking about situations and things like that is the beginning to unlearning some of these inherent biases that I believe we all have. And it is an ongoing process. And then my second thing would be, when you get called out on it, don't fight it, right? Don't fight it, just accept it. Because like, even if it's not true, the point is to not be angry when somebody says you cause them harm. Because like you can cause somebody harm without meaning to and without like inherently doing it. Like just recognize that you caused them harm and just be done with it. But if you call them out, if they called you out and you like think you might actually have done it, which 90% of the time is probably going to be true. And like you really got to look at like how you are as a person and try to like unlearn those behaviors, unlearn those tendencies. And it's a struggle. It's going to be constant mindfulness and things like that. And so instead of being like, what happened? I told my friend, I was like, hey girl, your booty looking fat. And she was just like, stop catcalling me. And I was like, okay, understood. And I was sitting there and I was like, is it catcalling? Because I would say it to a guy and I was like, well, do I have the right to say that to anybody? Like things like that. And like, even if I meant it as playful or whatever, like, it's just that's an example. Like I would never do that, but like,
Yeah.
as an example, just be like that and just say, okay, what would be an appropriate comment, blah, 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 blah. And so you really have to like think about it, and it takes a lot of work, thought, and mindfulness and introspection.
Definitely. And that's sort of a lifelong struggle there. I think you're right that it's
Yes.
really ongoing. So next I'll actually shift the conversation a little bit more back to Brave Space Alliance, because I've noticed just doing research and stuff that you've got a lot of different programs. And so to me, that sort of speaks to the intersectional nature of your organization. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about intersectionality and the importance of intersectionality to Brave Space Alliance.
I think intersectionality is one of the key focuses in Brave Space Alliance. When we talk about collective liberation, we don't talk about the liberation of just strictly Black people. We talk about the liberation of queer people as well. And and I think that small statement recognizes that Black people are not separate from queer people, that there are queer Black people. And so when we work on our collective liberation, and when we're fighting and working on our support groups and programs and thinking about how we can better serve the community, I don't think we really focus on specific queer issues. I think we focus on people. And so that looks like thinking about how can we make sure that everything we have is as accessible as possible, because people, not everybody is able-bodied. How can we make sure that we have translators, because not everybody's first language is English? How can we make sure that this is a safe space and like people have gender inclusive bathrooms, because we realize that not everybody is cis. And so it's working on all of those things. Like when we have a community member come in, we don't just address their queer needs, we address like all of them. We address them as a whole person. And so instead of compartmentalizing and having to go to like an African American center for your needs as a Black person, and then go to a disability center for your needs as a person with disabilities, or like having to go to a women's center as a woman. They're like, come here, and you're part of the community. So.
And I also think one thing I found cool was that you focus on a lot of different sort of overarching issues, like the barriers LGBTQ plus people face to food security and stuff like that. So I was wondering how, when Brave Space Alliance was sort of founded, how did you go about choosing what issues you wanted to sort of go into? Like, you've got a food bank. Like, how did you decide that was something you were interested in starting?
So that would be more, I never assumed to understand or say I know what's going on in the mind of Lasiah Wade. But in my opinion, with based on what the mission is, which is the collective liberation, I think that there was a need. I think BSA saw it and was like, people are going hungry, and we cannot fight for rights, and we cannot undo all of these systems of oppression if people are hungry. And we cannot undo the systems of oppression if people can't afford, like if people don't have jobs so they can pay their bills. We can't undo the systems of oppression if people don't have a place to sleep at night. So like just all of these things, we're just like, okay, how do we begin to unload some of the burden? Because when we're talking about marginalized people, it's a really abstract concept, I think, to a lot of people, and they don't really see it as all of the things that it is. And so a person who's struggling to feed themselves probably isn't just struggling to feed themselves, they're probably also struggling to keep stable housing. They're probably also struggling to have a job, because my thought process would be, other than an addiction, which is valid, if you have a livable wage and a place to sleep, and neither of those things are outside, and having a livable wage means that you are able to afford it, then how would you be hungry? There has to be some outside factors contributing, right? And not saying that somebody who has a livable wage and a place to sleep isn't hungry. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that factors easily compound and make it so that, you have to choose between housing, food, and medicine, or housing, food, and medical care, or housing, your job, and food, or housing, your job, and your children. And it's a lot. Like, capitalism is really killing us all. But I think that when we look at everything that it means to be poor and all of the things against, like Ari against you, we're like, okay, how do we begin to lift some of these burdens so that we can begin to even the playing field, in my opinion.
Awesome. And I was wondering if you could also, just because I'm curious, explain how your food bank works.
So the food bank, we have several. It's not just ours. We have partnered with a few other locations, and they have pickup days. And so at some of our food bank locations, you can go and pick up food at that location. Also, on our website, we have, let's see, I'm gonna actually pick it up. Produce program. I am looking for it. We have a thing on our website where you can fill out a form, and when you fill it out, you tell us like your age, well, maybe not your age, but how many people are in the house, if you're immunocompromised, if you have any dietary restrictions, and then we do deliveries, I believe, every other week on Friday. And so if you just sign up at our website in a week or two, food will show up at your house. We have volunteers who come to the space, pick up the food bags that we put together and deliver them out.
That's amazing. Very cool. And that brings me to the obligatory coronavirus question of sort of how have you, it's sort of a double question, but how have your operations changed because of the virus? And do you see any new barriers to your community members popping up, sort of like in healthcare or otherwise during the pandemic?
Coronavirus changed how we work and how we operate drastically, because we hadn't started our food pantry at that time, and COVID-19 hit, and we're like, well, people need to stay home, people need to stay home, and people are losing their jobs, and so we need to help. And so it was just like that. Like, we are going to start our food pantry now instead of whenever we were going to start it later, because it is needed now. And I think that our community is more heavily impacted because of the density in our community. I would say that you have more Black and brown people in apartments and more Black and brown people in one apartment on average. And most of those people also have essential worker jobs if they still have a job. And a lot of people don't have, a lot of marginalized communities don't have access to cars, and so they're dependent on public transit. And we definitely saw our community be more heavily impacted by COVID-19 due to all of those factors. And so that is why we started our food pantry, and we really wanted people to be able to stay home if they could, so that we could keep our community safe. We wanted to be able to help them as much as we could, while also keeping ourselves safe. And so a lot of our programs and a lot of our services were in person, and we had to figure out how we're going to get services to people without having them come into the space, so that we don't put ourselves at risk, but we still help our community. And so our support groups are completely online now for our mutual aid groups. At the beginning, we had a person who you could contact who would help you sign up for different government services. As always, we started the pantry, which you just go online, fill it out. And we understand that having things online isn't always accessible, but it was the best that we could do at the time. And so we're still trying to figure out a way to get to our community members that don't have access to internet or data or things like that, so that they don't get left behind, especially when they are probably most in need. But we definitely wanted to help out as much as possible. Also, people, if by chance people found a flyer or something just while they were out, it has our phone number on it, and so they can always call, and if they called, we could put them on the form as well. And so if you don't have access to internet and you need resources being put on the food pantry or connected to other government resources, you can always call, and we'll set you up, and we'll call you back and connect you with resources, or we'll put you on the pantry that very second. So it has changed how we operate, but not the fact that we still care for our community and are doing everything that we can for our community.
I'm glad that you're finding a way to navigate this odd time, but
it's difficult.
Yeah, it really is, especially when so much of your organization is driven by in-person intercommunication. And I guess now I'll circle back to something you actually said earlier, which you were talking about sort of the difference between brave spaces and safe spaces. And I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on that idea.
So you're in college, and when I was in college, we had an LGBT resource center, and it was supposed to be a safe space for LGBT people to go. But if you didn't come with the correct language of already having knowledge and understanding of LGBTQ queer issues, it wasn't a safe space for you because people felt attacked and unsafe there. And so it was really difficult because if you were new and didn't know what to say or misstepped or overstepped, then you might be kicked out and unwelcome, not allowed back. That didn't happen while I was there, but potentially had the thing to happen. And I know it does happen at other safe spaces where you will be uninvited and banned from spaces. And it's not based on intent to harm, it's based on a misunderstanding and just not knowing, not having the knowledge. And maybe even having a different framework of what is acceptable and what is not, because different communities have different languages. And so we take into account all of those nuances and understanding of different communities have different languages, and that you may not know the right things to say, and that you are trying to express your opinions, which are valid and understandable, and that the intent isn't always to harm. And not like we will not tolerate the constant malicious harming of a person, but also we don't find that our community is disposable, and so we'd rather put somebody through, like have somebody go through a restorative justice process than cancel them.
Yeah.
I feel like safe space is much about cancel culture, and our brave space is very much about restorative justice.
So if you have somebody who during a support group says something that's sort of not in line with your mission or makes somebody feel uncomfortable, you sort of choose to like bring them into the conversation as opposed.
Yes.
That's really cool. And sort of off that, just looking long term, you talk a lot about this idea of liberation. So I was wondering, sort of under that framework and out of that framework, what does liberation for your community look like to you?
For me personally, and I don't know if this is the opinion of all of Brave Space, but for me personally, we want everyone to have a place to sleep. We want everyone to have food. We want everyone to be able to live as the gender and sexuality that they choose without fear of persecution. So meaning that like they won't be dismissed from housing, they won't be fired from a job, they won't be discriminated against walking down the street, they won't be discriminated against by police. And we want people to have better access to education and different types of employment and healthcare, because all of these are very important. And we want to undo all of the things that are currently in place that are keeping Black and brown people oppressed and separated. And so it's really difficult to, like, when people think of like, oh, how do you end systematic oppression? And so if we just take a part of it, like systematic racism, even if there were no more racist people on the entire planet, everybody miraculously became anti-racist. I don't even know what that would look like, but if that happened, the systems would still be in place to keep Black and brown people oppressed. And that is systematic oppression. And so the system that has more police and a heavier police presence in Black and brown neighborhoods would still exist. And the fact that there are more Black and brown bodies incarcerated and thus separating families, that would still exist. And the lack of grocery stores and the lack of access to family planning resources in Black and brown neighborhoods would still exist. And that is systematic oppression. And so to start undoing that means to start bringing those resources into the community. So more grocery stores, more access to family planning, freeing people who have, especially in Illinois, freeing people who have marijuana charges now that weed is legal. And so just a beginning. That is it. Some steps and some of the things that I think that collective liberation looks like.
Yeah, I know it's a really big question. So thank you. And I guess just a little bit more specifically, what do you, and I don't know if this is something you would know, but what are Brave Space Alliance's next steps? Like, where do you go from here?
From here, just a few basic small steps that we are making. We are gearing up to support our community through the winter. And so we are figuring out how, in terms of a pandemic, we can provide the community and the homeless population and whoever needs it with winter coats and hand warmers and gloves and things like that, without risking infection. Another minor steps that we are working towards are contact tracing. We're working on that. And then long term, Brave Space Alliance is looking towards serving more of the community in different programs, like our employment justice program, which is yet to launch. And so that will be something that we are looking towards and some of the next steps that we'll be taking.
And are you looking to physically expand your outreach? I mean, I'm just wondering, like, how much of the South Side do your services currently cover exactly?
So I would say, at least because I've done a good portion of helping make the maps for the deliveries, I would say that we cover at least just an area, 80% South Side. Now, population, that's a different thing. But I think the last time I checked, just in Chicago alone, we had served 400,000 people in our pantry alone. That's just pantry. That's not the protests that we support. That's not the that's not the masks that we give out. That's not our support groups. That's not our mutual aid groups. That's just the food pantry. And so I would say that we are reaching people, but we can always reach more people.
Yeah. And how exactly do you support protests? I know you just mentioned that. Like, what do you...
We have a communications person who goes and, among other things, goes and talks to organizers of different actions. And we want to make sure that protesters have masks. We want to make sure that they have water, they have snacks. We want to make sure that if anybody gets arrested, once they get out, that they have the jail support of the food and the water and things like that. We want to make sure that they are connected with the legal observers and the street medics. And then if we are really involved in the protest, our communications person or our representative might even go and speak. We march in some protests. And so we're deeply engaged in a lot of the actions going on.
That's super cool. And now just to move a little bit to more like personal questions, I was just wondering how you got involved in this kind of work.
I grew up here in Chicago. I came out when I was 13. I found About Face Youth Theater and oh my gosh, there's one more. I cannot remember the other theater. Oh my gosh, Fonda is gonna kill me. 2 different theater groups basically, and I met a lot of my friends there. I met a lot of the current activists working in the community currently at those theater groups, and I just stayed involved. I did the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance, where they had queer LGBT youth on an advisory committee trying to figure out how we can make schools more accepting and inviting to queer youth. I volunteered with Alma and just so many different organizations. And so I think I eventually came across BSA after it was founded, probably maybe a year after. And I attended their events and speaking engagements whenever I could. And Stephanie and I went to school together, and she's one of the co-founders. No, she's one of the original members of BSA, original employees. There we go. That's what I was looking for. And so I knew a little bit about it, but when LaFaya Wade posted that she was looking for a personal assistant, I was like, I'm connected in the community. I don't know if I have any other qualifications, but maybe. And I was selected. And so I was really, really grateful. And I've been loving the work I've been doing ever since.
That's amazing. I know a lot of just being brought into activist spaces is by the people you meet along the way. So I was just interested in how you got to know them, which is cool.
I knew Stephanie from a while back, and then a friend of mine knew LaFaya Wade's partner, but I didn't have really any direct connection to BSA. I was just directly connected to the queer community in Chicago. And I think that in BSA, that's what's really important, is your connection to the community and your devotion to the community. And so I think that LaFaya and Stephanie saw that, and that's why I'm here.
And as we begin to sort of wrap things up, I was wondering what advice you'd give to any of the first years or anybody who's watching this to get involved with either Brave Space Alliance or helping out the community in general.
The advice I would give is it doesn't always have to be big. It doesn't always have to be big. We have a form online where people can come and volunteer, but more than that, like, people can always start with the introspection and like unlearning their initial biases and calling out like toxic and questionable behavior when they see it and be like, hey, I don't think we should be doing this. You know, just slowly work on your immediate friend groups and your family and things like that. That helps a lot. Just like in change, it's a million small conversations that has changed the public opinion of queer people thus far. And it's going to be a million small conversations that keep changing the opinion and keep pushing us forward. Also, donate. If you are affluent, give us your money. Because we will absolutely put those resources to use. When I was hired and one of the grant makers came in and they're like, what are you doing with the money we gave you? And we explained, and they're like, also we were able to hire a new staff member. I think it's really important to understand that when you hire a community member, you're not just improving the life of one community member, you're improving the life of literally 10 people who are directly connected to them who are also in the community. So like when I eat, my entire friend group eats. Like if I'm not going hungry, nobody around me is going hungry. If I have somewhere to stay, if I have housing, nobody around me is going to be homeless and nobody around me is not going to have housing. And so when you help one community member, it's more like, and you really help that one community member when you give them enough where they're in a position where they're absolutely not struggling and they are able to exist and thrive. Because I'm not existing, I'm not fighting, I'm not just living, I'm thriving. When you put them in a position to thrive, then you help bring up 10 more community members as well.
Yeah, it definitely spreads. Well, that's super useful because I know a lot of the freshmen, I did this program last year, and a lot of the first years coming in, they're coming from all around and they want to help. And it's just, giving people
fundraisers.
Yeah.
We have a whole bunch of drives that always go on, so people can always just donate, things like that. And then the other thing is like, if you can't donate supplies or time or even money, donate your connections. We always need something, and people have skills or people know people that they don't even realize we could talk to and we could utilize. And so donate connections, donate time, donate money, donate things.
Awesome. Well, that pretty much wraps up my questions. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
I'm happy to talk to you, and I hope that the incoming freshmen, despite like COVID-19 and everything going on, don't feel discouraged and feel empowered to make the fight for the collective liberation, especially given all that's going on.
Definitely. I think there's always a way to do something, even now, as your organization shows. So,
yeah,
definitely true. Thank you again.
Bye.
Bye.